The movie begins at Will's wedding, where his father, Edward, entertains the guests with a story about the day Will was born. Edward claims he used his wedding ring as bait to catch a rare catfish. Will, however, feels embarrassed, believing his father tells exaggerated tales just to grab attention. When Will confronts Edward about these fake stories, Edward insists they are true, creating tension between them. As a result, Will and Edward stop speaking to each other. 3 years later, while living in Paris, Will learns that his father has cancer and doesn't have much time left. He and his wife, Josephine, return to his hometown, where they meet Will's mother, Sandra, who has been caring for Edward during his illness. Edward is now bedridden and frail. Curious about his father's life, Will begins to ask him questions. This triggers a flashback where a young Edward and his 2 friends encounter a witch living in a swamp. The witch has a magical glass eye that reveals a person's death if they dare to look into it. Edward's friends are too scared to look, but Edward boldly gazes into the witch's eye and learns how he will die. Knowing his fate gives Edward a fearless outlook on life, as he believes nothing else can harm him until that moment. As Edward grows up, his body develops rapidly, but his bones can't keep up, leaving him bedridden and hooked to a machine for 3 years. Despite this setback, Edward becomes a school star and a local hero due to his extraordinary growth. One mysterious night, the town's sheep are attacked by an unknown creature. Worried, the mayor demands that the monster be dealt with, but he insists on avoiding any unnecessary bloodshed to keep the peace in the town. Hearing the mayor's concerns, Edward volunteers to talk to the monster and convince it to stop eating the town's sheep. Everyone agrees, and Edward discovers the monster is actually a giant named Carl. Edward tells Carl that the town is too small for both of them and suggests they move to a bigger city together. Carl agrees, and when the townspeople hear the monster has been dealt with, they are overjoyed. As a token of gratitude, the mayor gives Edward the key to the town. Edward and Carl leave the town together. Along the way, they encounter a dense forest. Edward decides to take a shortcut through the forest, but insists on going on foot, so the 2 part ways, agreeing to meet on the other side. While walking through the forest, Edward stumbles upon a strange town called Spectre, where the people don't wear shoes. Edward is welcomed by the town's mayor, Beeman, along with Beeman's wife Mildred, and their daughter Jenny. Beeman holds a clipboard with Edward's name on it, showing they were expecting him. But he arrived earlier than predicted. Jenny takes Edward's shoes and throws them onto a high rope at the town's entrance, where the shoes of other visitors are also hanging. That night, while wandering through the town, Edward spots a mermaid in a pond, leaving him amazed. After spending a day and night in Spectre, Edward realizes he's not ready to settle down there. When he announces his decision to leave, the townspeople are shocked. Jenny asks how Edward plans to cross the forest without shoes, but Edward decides to leave barefoot, promising Jenny he will return someday. As he walks through the forest, Edward loses the key to his old town, but eventually reunites with Carl on the main road, and the 2 continue their journey together. The flashback ends, and in the present, Edward shares with Josephine the story of how he met Sandra. He explains that after leaving Spectre, he and Carl stumbled upon a circus. The circus owner, Amos, hires Carl because his size and presence attract crowds. Edward notices a girl at the circus, and from that moment on, he is convinced she's the one he will marry. Determined to get to know her, he tries to approach her, but the crowd makes it impossible. Edward soon learns that the girl is a family friend of Amos, the circus owner. Eager to be closer to her, Edward asks Amos for a job at the circus. Amos agrees, but with a condition: Edward won't be paid. Instead, every month, Amos will give Edward a small piece of information about the girl. Edward accepts and works at the circus for 3 years, yet he still doesn't even know her name. Frustrated, Edward decides to confront Amos at his trailer, but before he can, a wolf lunges at him. Edward fends off the wolf with a stick, forcing it to retreat. The next morning, Edward discovers Amos waking up in the same spot where the wolf had been. It's then he realizes Amos is a werewolf, half human, half wolf. Grateful that Edward didn't harm him in his wolf form, Amos reveals the girl's name, Sandra. He also tells Edward that Sandra is studying at Auburn University. Without wasting time, Edward leaves the circus to find her. When Edward reaches the university, he confesses his love to Sandra. However, Sandra tells him she's engaged to Don, an old rival from Edward's hometown. Heartbroken but determined, Edward refuses to give up. One day, he fills Sandra's lawn with her favorite flowers, which enrages Don. Don brutally beats Edward, but Edward doesn't fight back because he promised himself not to act violently in front of Sandra. Witnessing Don's aggression, Sandra ends their engagement and eventually marries Edward. While recovering in the hospital from his injuries, Edward receives a draft notice for the Korean War. Though sad to leave his new wife, Edward isn't worried, as he knows how he'll die, thanks to the witch's prophecy. In the war, Edward takes on the most dangerous missions, hoping to finish his service quickly. During one mission, he parachutes into a North Korean camp to steal important documents. There, he encounters twin singers Ping and Jing, performing for the camp. Edward promises them a singing career in America if they help him escape. The twins agree and assist him in fleeing the camp. When Edward is reported missing, the army sends a letter to Sandra, leaving her devastated. Months later, after a long journey, Edward finally returns home to his wife. He then becomes a traveling salesman to save enough money to buy a good house. The flashback ends, and in the present, Sandra shows their son Will the army letter, proving some of Edward's stories were true. Back in the past, a young Edward is waiting in line at a bank when he meets Nerder, an old acquaintance from his hometown. Nerder tells Edward he left Spectre, inspired by Edward, but has since become an outlaw. He convinces Edward to help him rob the bank, but when they get inside, they find the bank has no cash. Edward uses this opportunity to explain to Nerder how the financial system works. Using Edward's advice, Nerder later makes a fortune on Wall Street and sends Edward $10,000 as a thank you. Edward uses the money to buy a house for Sandra and their son, Will. In the present, Will finds a paper with the name Spectre Town written on it. Curious, he visits Spectre and meets Jenny, who immediately recognizes him from family photos. Will asks Jenny how his father returned to Spectre a second time. Jenny recounts that one stormy night, Edward was driving when his car was swept underwater. While underwater, Edward encountered the same mermaid he had seen years ago during his first visit to Spectre. The next day, Edward's car is found stuck in a tree. Beneath the tree, Edward discovers the key he lost long ago. When he arrives in Spectre, he's shocked to see how much the town has changed. Once a beautiful and vibrant place, Spectre is now bleak and filled with despair. The presence of banks has left the townspeople drowning in debt, and most of them are bankrupt. Determined to save Spectre, Edward contacts his old friends, Nerder, the twins Ping and Jing, and Amos, and proposes a plan to buy the town. He manages to get the townspeople to sign deeds to sell their land. However, Jenny refuses to give him her deed. She's upset because Edward had promised to visit her but never came back. To win Jenny's trust, Edward notices the poor condition of her house and begins repairing it with the help of Carl. Once the house is restored, Jenny finally agrees to give him her deed. During this time, Jenny confesses that she loves Edward. However, Edward gently tells her that his heart belongs to his wife, Sandra. After finishing his work in Spectre, Edward leaves the town and never returns. Jenny shares this part of Edward's story with Will, explaining that while she is part of Edward's narrative, Sandra and Will are his true life. Shortly after Will returns home, news arrives that Edward has had a stroke and is in the hospital. The family is deeply concerned, but Edward reassures them not to worry, as this is not the death he foresaw in the witch's eyes. Will sends Sandra and his wife home, choosing to stay alone with Edward in the hospital. Curious about his own birth, Will asks the family doctor about it. The doctor reveals that Edward missed Will's birth due to work and never actually caught the fish Edward loved to talk about. Instead, the doctor explains that Edward told these fantastical stories to provide comfort and entertainment. Hearing this, Will begins to reconcile with Edward, realizing that the stories were never lies. They were Edward's way of making life more meaningful. That night, Edward becomes critically weak, barely able to speak. Unable to tell stories anymore, he asks Will to narrate the story of his death. At first, Will hesitates, saying he doesn't know what Edward saw in the witch's eyes. But Edward insists, so Will agrees. understanding that his father's story must have a proper ending. Will begins the tale. Edward regains his strength, and together they escape the hospital, driving Edward's car to a nearby river. There, all the people Edward has met throughout his life are gathered, celebrating his life with a grand farewell party instead of a funeral. Edward says goodbye to everyone before Will carries him to the river. There, Edward transforms into a giant catfish and swims away, fulfilling the prophecy of his death. As Edward listens, he smiles, knowing his son finally understands his passion for storytelling. Shortly after, Edward passes away peacefully, leaving behind a legacy of love, adventure, and stories that will be remembered forever. Will stays with Edward during his final moments, feeling both sadness over his father's passing and happiness for the bond they shared at the end. After Edward's death, a funeral is held. At first, it's just Will, Josephine, Sandra, and the family doctor present. Then, a long line of cars arrives, and people Edward had met in his life step out. Amos, Carl, Nerder, Jenny, Mr. Soggy Bottom, Ping and Jing, and Mayor Bayman. Will is amazed to see these characters from his father's stories, but he notices they are different from the versions Edward had described. Carl isn't a 12-foot giant, but a 7-foot man. Ping and Jing aren't conjoined twins, but simply twins. Will realizes that Edward's stories weren't lies. They were based on real people and events, but had been exaggerated to make them more magical. When Will's son is born, he begins telling him Edward's stories, keeping his father's memory alive.